Please, I just need a little more time. Claire Whitmore whispered, her voice barely steady as she clutched the thin folder against her chest. The fluorescent lights of Mercy General Hospital casting a harsh glow over her pale face, while the billing clerk across the counter gave her a polite but firm smile that didn't reach her eyes and shook her head as if she had already heard this story too many times before. And behind Claire, the waiting area buzzed with quiet conversations, the soft beeping of monitors, and the occasional echo of footsteps. But to her it all sounded distant, like she was underwater, because all she could think about was the number printed on that invoice and the reality that she was exactly $273 short. Not even enough to cover the initial portion of the prenatal test her doctor had insisted she couldn't delay any longer. Her fingers tightening around the folder as if holding it closer might somehow make the problem disappear, but it didn't. Nothing did. Not the sleepless nights, not the double shifts she had taken at the diner, not the careful counting of every dollar down to the last coin in her wallet, and certainly not the quiet panic that had been growing inside her ever since she first saw those two pink lines weeks ago. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the tiny life she carried, the one she hadn't planned for, the one she wasn't sure how to protect. And as the clerk gently slid the paperwork back toward her and asked her to step aside so the next patient could be helped, Claire nodded quickly, murmuring an apology as heat rushed to her cheeks, the familiar sting of humiliation creeping in as she turned away, trying to keep her head down, trying not to notice the subtle glances from the people waiting behind her, the quiet judgment she imagined in their eyes. And that's when it happened, her foot catching on the edge of her worn sneaker as she shifted her weight too quickly, the folder slipping from her grasp as if her fingers had suddenly forgotten how to hold on, papers scattering across the polished tile floor in a soft, helpless cascade that felt louder than it should have. And for a split second she froze, her breath catching as she dropped to her knees to gather them, her hands moving quickly, almost frantically, as if she could erase the moment before anyone really saw. But one sheet had slid farther than the others, gliding across the floor until it stopped just inches away from a pair of polished black shoes, the kind that didn't belong in a place like this unless someone very important was wearing them. And Claire's heart sank even before she looked up, her fingers hesitating mid-motion as a quiet presence seemed to fill the space around her. And then a hand moved into her line of sight, steady, deliberate, picking up the single sheet she hadn't been able to reach. And she knew what it was before she even saw it in his grasp. The ultrasound image printed in soft gray tones, the faint outline of a tiny form that had already changed everything. And for a moment the world seemed to narrow to that one piece of paper, to the way his fingers held it. Just a fraction longer than necessary, to the silence that followed as if time itself had paused to watch what would happen next. And when Claire finally forced herself to lift her gaze, her stomach dropped, because standing there, holding the one thing she had tried so hard to keep hidden, was Adrian Cole, the CEO of Cole Enterprises. A man whose name was whispered with a mix of respect and intimidation in every boardroom in the city. A man she had once known in a completely different context. A man she had hoped never to run into again. And yet here he was, impossibly composed in a tailored charcoal suit that looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine rather than in a hospital billing area, his expression unreadable at first, his sharp eyes scanning the image in his hand with a focus that made her chest tighten, and Claire felt a surge of panic so sudden it almost stole her breath. Pushing herself up from the floor as she reached out instinctively, her voice trembling, despite her effort to sound calm. "I'm sorry, that's mine," she said quickly, too quickly, as if speed alone could undo what had just happened. But he didn't hand it back right away, didn't even look at her. Immediately, his gaze still fixed on the paper as something subtle shifted in his expression, something that wasn't quite shock, but wasn't indifference either, and the silence stretched just long enough to feel dangerous, long enough for Claire to realize that this moment, this small, accidental mistake, might not be something she could simply walk away from, because Adrian Cole wasn't the kind of man who overlooked details, and the way his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the ultrasound told her one thing with terrifying clarity. He wasn't just seeing it, he was noticing it. And when his eyes finally lifted to meet hers, there was a question there, unspoken but unmistakable, one that made her pulse race as if her body already knew the answer would change everything. Claire's fingers hovered in the air for a second longer, her breath shallow as she waited for Adrian to hand the paper back. But he did not move, and the stillness between them grew heavier with every passing second until it felt like the entire hospital floor had faded away, leaving only the two of them and the quiet tension that neither of them acknowledged out loud. And when he finally shifted his gaze from the image to her face, it was not confusion she saw there, but something sharper, something deliberate, as if he was already piecing together fragments she had not even realized were visible. And that realization sent a flicker of fear through her chest as she forced her voice to remain steady. "It is just a routine check," she said quickly, reaching again, this time more firmly, but his hand lifted slightly out of reach, not aggressively, just enough to pause her. And the small motion alone was enough to remind her exactly who he was, a man who never did anything without intention, a man who noticed details other people overlooked. And she felt her pulse quicken as his eyes dropped back to the paper, scanning it again, slower this time, more carefully, his expression tightening in a way that made her stomach twist, because she knew what he was looking at now, not just the image but the numbers printed in the corner, the date, the measurements, the quiet pieces of information that did not seem important to anyone else but could mean everything to him. And for a brief moment she considered grabbing it and walking away, pretending none of this mattered. But her feet would not move, rooted in place by the weight of his attention. And then he spoke, his voice low, controlled, but carrying a subtle edge that made it impossible to ignore. "How far along are you?" he asked, not as a casual question, but as a calculation. And Claire felt the words hit her like a physical force, her mind scrambling for an answer that would not lead to more questions. "It does not matter," she replied softly, shaking her head as if dismissing the entire situation. But even as she said it, she knew it sounded weak, unconvincing, and Adrian did not look convinced at all. If anything, his gaze sharpened, his grip on the paper tightening just slightly as he tilted it, his eyes narrowing as if confirming something he had already suspected, and the silence that followed was worse than anything he could have said, because it gave her time to think, to remember, to replay moments she had tried so hard to forget. And she saw it then, the exact second something shifted in him, his posture stiffening almost imperceptibly, his jaw tightening as his attention fixed on the date printed in the corner. And Claire's heart skipped as she realized what he was doing, counting backwards, connecting timelines, lining up a moment in the past that neither of them had spoken about since it happened. And she shook her head instinctively, stepping back as if distance alone could undo the realization forming in his mind. "You are reading too much into it," she said quickly, her voice barely holding together. But Adrian did not respond right away, his eyes still locked on the paper, his expression changing in a way she had never seen before, the calm, composed, slipping just enough to reveal something underneath, something unsettled, something that made her chest tighten with a different kind of fear. Because Adrian Cole did not react like that without reason. And when he finally looked up at her again, there was no uncertainty left in his gaze, only a quiet intensity that felt far more dangerous. And he spoke again, slower this time, each word measured. "Claire," he said, her name sounding unfamiliar on his lips after so long. "This date." He paused, as if choosing how much to reveal, how much to push, and Claire felt her breath catch, knowing exactly where this was going even before he finished the thought, because there was only one reason he would be looking at that number the way he was, only one memory it could lead back to, and the realization settled between them like something unavoidable, something that could not be ignored any longer. And for the first time since she had dropped the paper, Claire understood that this was no longer just an accident. It was the beginning of something she might not be able to stop. The word hung unfinished between them. But Claire did not need him to complete it because she could already see the conclusion forming behind his eyes, precise and unavoidable, and her heart began to pound harder as she shook her head again, more firmly this time, stepping back another inch as if she could physically push away the implication. "Do not," she said under her breath, her voice trembling despite her effort to stay composed. But Adrian did not react to her denial, not the way she hoped he would. Instead, his attention returned to the ultrasound, his gaze locking onto the date with a focus that felt almost surgical, and she watched as his fingers shifted slightly, as if anchoring himself to the evidence in his hand. And then he exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but heavier than before, as though something inside him had just settled into place. And when he finally spoke again, his tone was quieter, but far more certain. 8 weeks, he said, not as a question but as a statement, his eyes lifting to meet hers with a clarity that made her chest tighten, because he was not guessing. He was calculating, and she could see it happening in real time, the timeline aligning in his mind, the memory he was tracing back to, the night neither of them had ever mentioned again. And Claire felt a surge of panic rise in her throat as she forced a small, strained smile. "There are a lot of people in this world, Adrian," she said, quickly, trying to deflect, trying to introduce doubt where there was none. But he did not even blink at her words, did not look away, and that was what unsettled her the most, because Adrian Cole had always been a man who considered every angle, every possibility, and the fact that he was not entertaining any alternatives now meant he had already dismissed them. And the realization made her stomach twist as she reached for the paper again, more urgently this time. "Please," she added, her voice softer, almost pleading, but still he did not release it. Not immediately, his grip steady as his expression shifted once more, something colder surfacing beneath the calm exterior she remembered so well. And when he spoke again, there was a weight behind his words that made it impossible to ignore. "The date matches," he said, each word deliberate, his gaze never leaving hers. And Claire felt the air leave her lungs in a quiet rush, her mind scrambling for something, anything, that could break the connection he had just drawn. But there was nothing, no explanation she could give that would not lead to more questions, and the silence stretched again, thicker now, heavier with everything that had not been said, and she could feel the attention of the room beginning to creep back in, the distant awareness of people moving around them, of conversations continuing as if this moment was not unraveling her entire sense of control. And she swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. "You are mistaken," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, they sounded hollow, lacking the conviction she desperately needed them to carry, and Adrian's expression did not change, not in the way she hoped. Instead, his eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in focus, as if he was watching her reaction more closely than her words, measuring the hesitation, the fear she could not fully hide. And that was when she realized the worst part of all of this. He did not need her to confirm anything, not yet, because he was already reading the truth in everything she was trying so hard to conceal. And the thought sent a chill through her as she finally managed to close the distance enough to take the paper from his hand, her fingers brushing his briefly, the contact fleeting but enough to send a jolt through her nerves, and she pulled it back quickly, clutching it against her chest as if she could shield it from him, from the conclusions he was drawing. But it was too late for that, far too late, and Adrian's gaze followed the movement, lingering for a moment before lifting back to her face, his expression now fully composed again. But there was something new behind it, something resolute, something that made her chest tighten with a different kind of fear, because she recognized that look. She had seen it before in a different setting, in a different context, when he had made decisions that changed entire companies, entire lives, and she knew exactly what it meant. He was not letting this go, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was calm, controlled, but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. It was not a suggestion, not a casual observation. It was the beginning of something far more serious, something that would not end here. "We need to talk," he said, and Claire felt her pulse spike as she realized that whatever she had hoped to keep hidden had just become impossible to contain. The words settled heavily between them, and Claire felt her chest tighten as if the air itself had grown thinner, her fingers gripping the ultrasound tighter against her chest while her mind raced for an escape that did not exist, because she knew exactly what "we need to talk" meant when it came from someone like Adrian Cole. It was not a suggestion, it was a decision already made, and she shook her head almost immediately, a reflex born from fear more than logic. "No," she said quickly, the words slipping out before she could soften it, and for a brief moment something flickered across his face, not surprise but a subtle shift, as if he had expected resistance and was already prepared for it. and that realization only made her more desperate to regain control of the situation. "There is nothing to talk about," she added, her voice steadier this time, though her pulse was still racing, and she stepped back another inch, putting just enough space between them to feel like she could still walk away, because that was the only option she had left, to leave before this turned into something she could not manage. But Adrian did not move to block her, did not raise his voice or create a scene, and somehow that was worse, because his calm was never passive, it was calculated, and she could feel his attention following every small movement she made, analyzing, waiting, and when he finally spoke again, his tone was quieter, almost controlled to the point of restraint. "You expect me to believe that?" he asked, not with disbelief but with a quiet challenge that made her stomach twist, and Claire forced herself to meet his gaze even as everything inside her told her to look away, because looking away would be an admission, and she could not afford that. Not now. Not when everything was already slipping out of her control. "You should," she replied, lifting her chin slightly as if confidence alone could make it true, but the words felt fragile the moment they left her lips, and Adrian's expression did not soften. If anything, it sharpened, his eyes narrowing just slightly, as if focusing on a detail he had not yet fully examined. And then he took a small step forward, not enough to invade her space, but enough to close the distance she had just created, and the subtle shift was enough to remind her that she was not the one dictating the pace of this conversation. "Claire," he said again, her name deliberate, measured, and there was something in the way he said it that pulled her back to a different time, a different version of him, one that had known her far better than she wanted to admit, and she felt her resolve falter for just a second before she forced it back into place. "You are making assumptions," she said, trying to redirect, trying to create doubt where there was none, but Adrian did not respond immediately, his gaze dropping briefly to the folder pressed against her chest before returning to her face, and that single glance made her tighten her hold instinctively, as if he could take it from her again at any moment. And when he spoke next, his voice was softer, but somehow more dangerous. "Then correct me," he said, and the simplicity of the request hit harder than any accusation could have, because it left no room for deflection, no space to hide behind vague answers. And Claire felt her throat tighten as she searched for something to say that would not lead to the truth he was already closing in on. But there was nothing, no explanation that would hold under the weight of his attention, and the silence stretched again, filled only by the distant sounds of the hospital around them. And for a moment she considered telling him something, anything, just to break the tension, but she stopped herself, because she knew once she started, she would not be able to control where it ended, and she could not risk that. Not when she had spent weeks building a fragile sense of control over her situation, and she shook her head again, this time slower, more deliberate. "I do not owe you an explanation," she said quietly. And the moment the words left her mouth, she saw the shift in him, subtle but undeniable, his posture straightening just slightly, his expression settling into something far more defined, and she realized too late that she had crossed a line she did not fully understand. Because Adrian Cole was not a man who accepted being shut out without response, and when he spoke again, his tone was no longer questioning. It was certain, firm in a way that made her pulse spike. "You are right," he said, and for a brief second relief flickered in her chest, but it vanished just as quickly as his next words followed, calm and unyielding. "But if that child is connected to me, this is no longer just your decision." And Claire felt the ground beneath her sense of control shift completely as the weight of what he was saying settled in, because this was no longer a conversation she could walk away from, and the realization pressed in on her with a quiet intensity that made it impossible to ignore. She was not just facing a question anymore. She was facing a man who had already decided to find the answer. Claire felt the weight of his words settle into her chest like something heavy and unmovable, her fingers tightening around the folder as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded, and for a moment she said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that would change the direction this was heading, and that silence seemed to confirm something for Adrian, because his expression shifted again, not into anger, not into frustration, but into something far more controlled, something decisive, and without another word he turned slightly, his attention moving past her toward the billing counter she had just left. and before Claire could process what he was doing, he stepped forward. With quiet authority, his presence alone enough to draw immediate attention from the staff, and the same clerk who had just turned Claire away straightened instantly, her polite smile returning with a different kind of alertness. "Mr. Cole," she said, recognizing him without hesitation, and Claire's breath caught as she realized what was happening, a flicker of alarm rising in her chest as she took a step forward. "You do not need to do that," she said quickly, her voice low but urgent. But Adrian did not look back at her, did not even acknowledge the protest, his focus already on the clerk as he spoke in a calm, measured tone that carried unmistakable authority. "Her account," he said simply, nodding slightly in Claire's direction without turning. "Process everything, including any pending tests and follow-ups." And the clerk hesitated only for a fraction of a second before nodding, already reaching for the system as if this was the most natural instruction in the world, and Claire felt her chest tighten as the reality of what he was doing hit her all at once. The control she had been clinging to slipping further out of her grasp. "No," she said again, this time more firmly as she stepped closer, her hand instinctively reaching out as if she could physically stop the situation from moving forward. "I cannot accept that," she added, her voice steady but laced with something deeper, something that was not just resistance but fear, because accepting help from him meant opening a door she had spent weeks trying to keep closed. But Adrian finally turned then, his gaze meeting hers with a calm that felt almost immovable, and there was no hesitation in his expression, no uncertainty, just a quiet certainty that made her pulse spike. "This is not a negotiation," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, but firm enough that it left no room for argument. And Claire felt something twist inside her chest at the tone, not because it was harsh, but because it was final, and she shook her head again, stepping back slightly as if creating space would somehow restore her control. "You cannot just decide things for me," she said, her voice tightening, despite her effort to keep it steady, and Adrian's gaze held hers for a moment longer before shifting briefly toward the clerk, who was already processing the payment, and then back to Claire, and when he spoke again, his tone softened just slightly, but the resolve behind it did not change. "I already did," he replied, and the simplicity of the statement made her breath catch, because there was no arrogance in it, no need to prove anything, just a quiet statement of fact, and Claire felt her defenses falter for a second as the implications settled in, the reality that he was stepping into a situation she had not invited him into, and she did not know how to stop it. And the clerk's voice cut gently through the tension as she confirmed that everything had been covered, her tone professional but noticeably more accommodating than before, and Claire stood there for a moment, caught between frustration and something far more complicated, her mind racing as she tried to decide what to do next. But before she could find a response, Adrian spoke again, his voice quieter now, but carrying the same controlled intensity that had been there from the start. "You needed help," he said, as if stating something obvious, and Claire shook her head immediately, her grip tightening on the folder again. "That does not give you the right," she replied. But even as she said it, she knew the situation had already moved beyond her control, because this was not just about money anymore. It was about something much bigger, something neither of them had fully said out loud yet, and Adrian's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer before he spoke again, his tone steady, unwavering. "It does if what you are carrying is connected to me." And Claire felt her heart skip as the words landed, heavier than anything he had said before, because this was no longer just an implication. It was a line being drawn, a claim beginning to take shape, and for the first time since this started, she realized that walking away might not be as simple as turning around and leaving, because Adrian Cole was not just offering help. He was stepping into her life with a certainty that made it clear he was not planning to step back out. Claire stood there for a moment longer, her thoughts colliding in a quiet storm as the weight of everything that had just happened pressed in on her from all sides. And for a brief second the hospital around her seemed to blur again, the voices, the footsteps, the distant sounds fading into the background as something else surfaced in her mind, something she had worked hard to keep buried, and before she could stop herself, she saw it again. Not the sterile white lights of the hospital, but the warm glow of a city skyline months ago, the reflection of glass windows stretching across a quiet evening, the memory sharp and uninvited as it pulled her back to the moment everything had changed, because it had not been planned. It had not been something she had built toward. It had been a single night wrapped in exhaustion and emotion, a night when everything between them had shifted in a way neither of them had fully understood at the time. And she remembered the way Adrian had looked at her then, not as the distant, controlled CEO, but as a man who had let his guard slip for just long enough to blur the lines between what was professional and what was personal. And for a moment she had believed that meant something, that it could lead somewhere. But reality had come back quickly, colder and far less forgiving, and the distance between them had returned almost immediately, sharper than before, leaving her with nothing but questions she had never asked and answers she had never received. And when she had realized weeks later that she was pregnant, the decision had not felt like a choice at all. It had felt like survival, because reaching out to him had seemed impossible, not just because of who he was, but because of how things had ended. The silence, the unspoken understanding that whatever had happened between them had no place in his world. And so she had stayed quiet, telling herself it was easier that way, safer, that she could handle it on her own, even when every day proved just how difficult that would be. And now standing here, with him just a few feet away, that fragile decision was unraveling faster than she could hold it together, and she forced herself back into the present, her grip tightening on the folder as she lifted her gaze to meet his again. But the memory had already left its mark, softening something in her expression for just a second too long, because Adrian noticed. Of course he did, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he had caught a glimpse of something she had not meant to reveal, and that only made her straighten, pulling her composure back into place as she tried to rebuild the wall she had been holding up since this began. "You do not understand," she said quietly, her voice steadier now, but carrying a weight that had not been there before, and Adrian's gaze held hers, unblinking, as if waiting for her to continue, as if he knew there was more behind those words than she was willing to say. But she stopped herself, because explaining meant opening the door she had spent so long keeping closed, and she could not risk that, not when everything was already so uncertain. And the silence stretched again. But this time it felt different, less like a standoff and more like something unresolved, something neither of them had fully faced before. And Adrian took a slow breath, his posture shifting just slightly as if adjusting to the new dynamic between them, his voice quieter when he spoke again, but no less firm. "Then make me understand," he said, and the words landed with a quiet intensity that made her chest tighten, because there was no accusation in them, no demand, just a clear expectation that she would not be able to walk away from this without saying something. And Claire hesitated, her mind racing as she searched for the safest response, the one that would reveal the least while still holding her ground. And after a moment she shook her head again, but this time the movement was slower, less defensive, more deliberate. "It was not supposed to matter," she said softly, the admission slipping out before she could stop it. And the moment it did, she felt the shift between them, subtle but undeniable, because Adrian did not look away, did not dismiss it, his attention sharpening as if that single sentence had confirmed more than anything else she had said. And Claire felt her pulse quicken as she realized she had just given him something he could not ignore, something that tied the present back to the past in a way that made everything far more real. And the quiet tension returned, heavier now, filled with the weight of what had been left unsaid for far too long. And she understood then that this was no longer just about a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was about a moment they had both tried to move past, a moment that had now found its way back into their lives, with consequences neither of them could ignore. Adrian did not respond immediately, and that silence felt heavier than anything he could have said, his gaze fixed on Claire with a level of focus that made it clear he was not just listening to her words, but dissecting them, breaking them apart to find what she was still trying to hide. And when she said it was not supposed to matter, something in his expression shifted again, subtle but unmistakable, as if that single sentence had aligned with a conclusion he had already been forming. And he took a slow breath, his posture straightening slightly as if settling into a decision that had already been made somewhere beneath the surface. "It mattered," he said quietly, not as an argument but as a correction, his tone calm, but carrying a weight that made Claire's chest tighten, because he was not speaking about the present anymore. He was speaking about the past, About that night she had tried so hard to minimize in her own mind. And Claire shook her head instinctively, her fingers tightening around the folder again as she tried to pull the moment back under control. "You do not get to decide that now," she replied, her voice steadier than before but still edged with something fragile, something that betrayed how much this conversation was affecting her. And Adrian's gaze did not waver. If anything, it sharpened, his attention locking onto her reaction in a way that made it clear he was no longer guessing. He was confirming, and he took a small step closer, just enough to narrow the space between them without making a scene, his voice lower when he spoke again, but more precise, more deliberate. 8 weeks, he repeated, as if anchoring the conversation to that one undeniable fact. That puts the date exactly where it needs to be. And Claire felt her breath catch, her mind racing as she tried to interrupt, to redirect, but he did not give her the chance, because he continued before she could speak, his words measured, controlled, but carrying an intensity that made it impossible to ignore. "Late November," he said, and the memory hit her instantly, sharper this time, more vivid, because he was not just implying it anymore, he was naming it, placing it directly between them, and Claire's heart pounded as she shook her head again. But the denial felt weaker now, less convincing even to herself. "That does not prove anything," she said quickly, but Adrian did not react to the words, his eyes never leaving hers, watching, waiting, and then he spoke again, softer this time, but with a certainty that made her chest tighten. "You disappeared the week after," he added, and the statement landed heavier than anything else he had said, because it was not just about the timeline anymore. It was about her actions, about the choice she had made to leave without explanation, and Claire felt a flicker of something deeper move through her, something she had kept buried alongside everything else, and she looked away for the first time, just for a second, but it was enough, because when she looked back, Adrian's expression had changed again, not dramatically, but enough for her to see it, the shift from analysis to something more certain, something that no longer needed confirmation. And that realization sent a quiet wave of panic through her chest, because she understood then that he was no longer trying to figure it out. He already had, and the way he stood there, composed but unyielding, made it clear that this was no longer a question in his mind. It was a fact he was beginning to accept, and Claire swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze again. But the balance between them had already shifted, the fragile distance she had tried to maintain collapsing under the weight of his certainty. And when he spoke again, his voice was calm, controlled, but carrying a finality that made her pulse spike. "You can deny it," he said quietly, "but the numbers do not." And Claire felt the truth of that settle in her chest with a quiet, undeniable force, because no matter how much she tried to avoid it, the timeline was not something she could change. And Adrian Cole was not the kind of man who ignored facts once he had seen them. And the way he looked at her now made it clear that this was no longer something she could keep to herself, because he was already stepping closer to the answer, whether she gave it to him or not. Claire felt the truth of his words settle over her like something inescapable, and for a moment she could not breathe properly, her chest tightening as every wall she had carefully built over the past weeks began to crack under the weight of his certainty. And she shook her head again. But this time it was slower, weaker, as if even her own denial was starting to lose its strength. "You do not understand what you are asking," she said, her voice quieter now, no longer defensive but edged with something far more vulnerable. And Adrian's gaze did not soften, but it shifted, just slightly, as if he had begun to see beyond the surface of her resistance, as if he recognized that this was no longer just about avoiding a question. It was about something deeper, something she had been carrying alone for far too long, and the realization seemed to settle into him in a way that made his next words slower, more measured. "Then explain it to me," he said, and the calm insistence in his tone made her chest tighten even more, because there was no way to answer that without opening everything she had been trying to keep hidden. And Claire felt her grip on the folder loosen slightly, her fingers trembling as the pressure of the moment became too much to hold back any longer. And she let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her shoulders dropping just a fraction as the fight drained out of her, replaced by something heavier, something raw. And when she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost unsteady. "I did not tell you because there was nothing to tell," she said, the words coming out unevenly, and Adrian's brows drew together slightly, not in confusion but in focus, as if he was trying to follow the logic she was laying out. And Claire swallowed hard before continuing, her eyes dropping briefly to the floor before lifting back to meet his. It was one night, she added, the memory pressing closer now, no longer something she could push aside. One moment that was never supposed to become anything more, and the admission hung between them, heavy and exposed. And for the first time since this began, Adrian did not interrupt, did not challenge her immediately, and that silence gave her just enough space to keep going, even though every word felt like it was pulling something fragile apart inside her. You went back to your world, she continued, her voice steadying slightly as she forced the truth out piece by piece. And I went back to mine, and there was no place where those two things met, and Adrian's gaze remained fixed on her, unblinking, absorbing every word, and she could see something shifting behind his composure, something that was not quite anger and not quite regret, but something that made her chest tighten all the same. And she shook her head again, this time not in denial but in quiet acceptance of what she was saying. When I found out, you were already gone, she added, her voice softer now, the edges of it fraying slightly. And I told myself it was better that way. And the moment the words left her mouth, something in her expression broke, just enough to reveal the truth she had been holding back, not just the facts, but the weight of carrying them alone. And Adrian saw it, of course he did, his gaze sharpening slightly, as if that final piece had shifted everything into place. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them again. But this time it was different, not tense in the same way, but heavy with understanding, with the reality of what had been said and what it meant. And Claire felt her chest rise and fall unevenly as she tried to steady herself, her fingers tightening around the folder again as if she needed something to hold on to. And she shook her head one last time, her voice barely above a whisper when she spoke again. I was not trying to hide anything from you, she said, and the words lingered in the air, fragile but honest, and Adrian's gaze held hers for a moment longer before something shifted in him, subtle but unmistakable, as if her explanation had not changed his conclusion but had deepened it. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, but carrying a weight that made her pulse quicken. You did not give me the chance to know, he said, and Claire felt the impact of that settle into her chest, because for the first time since this began, this was not just about facts or timelines. It was about something personal, something unresolved between them, and the realization made it clear that this was no longer just a situation to manage. It was something far more complicated, something that was not going to end with a simple answer. Claire felt the weight of his words settle deep within her chest, and for a moment she could not respond, her breath catching as something inside her shifted in a way she had not expected, because this was no longer just about whether he knew or did not know. It was about the fact that now he did, and that changed everything. And she tightened her grip on the folder again, as if holding onto it could somehow steady the storm building inside her. But it did not. Nothing did, and she shook her head slowly, her voice barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. You would not have wanted to know, she said, the words fragile but firm, and Adrian's gaze did not waver, his expression unreadable for a brief moment before something deeper settled into it, something that was not easily dismissed, and he took a slow breath, his posture straightening just slightly as if grounding himself before responding. You do not get to decide that for me, he said quietly, and the calm certainty in his tone made her chest tighten all over again, because there was no anger in it, no raised voice, just a clear line being drawn. And Claire looked away for a second, her eyes lowering as she tried to gather her thoughts, because she had already said more than she ever intended to, and yet it still did not feel like enough to explain the choices she had made. And when she looked back at him, there was something softer in her expression, something conflicted. It was not just about you, she said, her voice steadier now, but still carrying the weight of everything she had been holding back. It was about what I could handle, what I could survive, and the admission lingered between them, quiet but powerful, and Adrian's gaze sharpened slightly, not in rejection but in understanding, as if he was beginning to see the situation from a perspective he had not considered before. And for a moment the tension shifted, not disappearing but changing, becoming something more complex, something layered with both conflict and connection, and Claire felt it too. The shift that made this moment feel less like a confrontation and more like the beginning of something neither of them had planned for, and she exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping just a fraction as the weight of pretending lifted, even if only slightly. And then Adrian spoke again, his voice calm but carrying a quiet authority that made her pulse quicken. "This is not something you carry alone anymore," he said, and the words landed with a force that was not aggressive but undeniable, and Claire felt her chest tighten as she processed what he was saying, because this was not just concern, it was intention. It was a statement of involvement that she had not invited but could not easily refuse, and she shook her head again, though the movement lacked the certainty it had before. "You cannot just step into this and change everything," she replied. But even as she said it, she knew that something had already changed, something irreversible, and Adrian's gaze held hers, steady and unyielding. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter but carried a weight that made it impossible to ignore. "It already has," he said, and Claire felt her breath catch, because there was truth in that she could not deny, not after everything that had just unfolded, and the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was filled with the reality of what came next, something neither of them had fully defined yet, but something that was already beginning to take shape. And Adrian took a small step back, just enough to give her space, but not enough to create distance, his eyes still fixed on her, as if making sure she understood that this was not the end of the conversation. And when he spoke again, his tone was calm, controlled, but carrying a final note that made her pulse spike one more time. "We're going to figure this out," he said, not as a suggestion, but as a certainty. And Claire felt the weight of those words settle into her chest as she stood there, caught between the life she had been trying to manage on her own and the reality that had just walked back into it, uninvited but impossible to ignore. And for the first time since this began, she realized that the hardest part was not what had already happened, but what was about to come next, because whatever this was, whatever it would become, it was no longer just her story, it was theirs.